Let's imagine a scenario, Tim, in which the Confederacy has agreed an armistice and the Confederacy is established as an independent nation. I mean, there are so many what-ifs that flow from that. Just to throw one at you to kick things off. Does the Union keep its capital in Washington? Because you might say it is uncomfortably close to the Confederacy.
Yeah, it's a great question. It is uncomfortably close to the Confederacy. It would literally share a border with a nation that it had been fighting. It's very difficult to say. I think a lot of it, again, depends on the surrounding countryside. Maryland, as Chris pointed out, was a slave state when the Civil War began, but then it, by its own volition, issues emancipation in November of 1864. So it becomes free territory before the end of the war. And I think that makes Washington, D.C. a little bit more comfortable because now it's surrounded by a friendly government. However, it is possible that you may have to move Washington, D.C. because, you know, if in the future these two nations mean to carry on peaceable relations, there could always be the worry of spies slipping in and out of Washington across the Potomac River and then, you know, taking precious diplomatic information back to the Confederate States of America. And we have every reason to believe this could happen because it did happen during the Civil War. You know, there were Confederate sympathizers in Washington, D.C. who regularly fled across the Potomac River to give the Confederates information about military movements. And I would imagine that the U.S. government would probably want to keep their government further away from that kind of political intrigue and espionage. Where they would set up, I don't know, but yeah, Washington, D.C. as a capital, its days might be numbered.
Yeah, it could be Philadelphia, it could be New York, who knows? I suppose one of the things we do have to address, Dr. Chris Parry, is the issue of slavery in the Confederacy. How long does that last? Because presumably at some point there would be, you know, sanctions, almost a bit like apartheid South Africa faced sanctions.
Well, I think it's probably more direct and subtle than that. If you look at where the Confederacy would have traded after this, just think, so the British are all over the West Indies. Quite a lot of cotton goes to Britain as well. The closest ally that the Confederacy are likely to have is probably going to be England and the British Empire. So you've got a country, England, that has said, you know, we're actually suppressing slavery now. So a condition of you trading with us actually is that you abolish slavery. So it might have happened anyway, to tell you the truth. And so the pressure to actually obviously grow an economy, to actually get out there in the world to be able to trade and things like that might have been dependent very much on abolishing slavery. So it may have taken a bit longer, but with the pressure coming from the British Empire and Britain in particular, I would think it would have been necessary to do something about that. I mean, there's a lot of myths about slavery. I think, you know, quite a lot of people in the South didn't keep slaves, for example. You know, 5% of people owned 20 or more slaves. The whole system itself was actually decaying very rapidly. So I think, you know, at the end of the Civil War, probably within a generation, slavery would have disappeared. And it may actually have developed in a more progressive and more positive way than it actually did, because so many accommodations had to be made to integrate the South back into the Northern system again, that you ended up, I think, as we have a system, you know, the results of that system can be seen today. So you might have had a smoother process. What I find interesting is the geopolitical issue. So if you look at America's expansion to the west here, would we have seen a divided expansion to the west? And the Confederacy, for example, going into this territory here, New Mexico, Arizona, even California.
Does it even go into Mexico?
Well, absolutely, James. So there's obviously a drive, and would the southern states been orientated south towards Central America? You know, who builds the Panama Canal? Under those circumstances, is it the Union or is it the Confederacy?
Big questions already. Just park that for one moment. We'll come back to that. Tim, I do want to bring you in on the slavery point. How long do you think slavery would have lasted in an independent Confederacy?
Oh, there's no telling. You know, it's important to realize that the Confederates' goal of preserving slavery is not just about the economics of it, but it is also about matters of racial control. You know, the slave owners of the Confederacy made it very clear when the war begins that this is not just about profiting off the institution, but it's also about making a tiered system where African Americans are considered to be the inferior race. So there's a speech that is delivered by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, in March of 1861 called the Cornerstone Speech, where he clarifies the meaning of the Confederacy. And he says that the cornerstone upon which the Confederacy rests is the fundamental belief that African Americans are not equal to white men. And this is a thing that most of the white South believes in. And so one of the things I would say is that despite the fact that there could be international pressure from future Confederate allies to do away with slavery, the Confederacy will take incredible steps to ensure that white supremacy remains. And this, as an American, this is a nightmarish scenario that I just shudder to contemplate because, it takes a good 100 years for this country to produce a national civil rights act and a voting rights act in the 1960s. And so that's how long after slavery happens before we get a concerted effort to bring about civil rights. And the only way that that happens is that when Civil War ends, we get a 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery and a 14th Amendment that makes federal citizenship a guarantee. That leads immediately to African Americans holding political office, voting in national elections, voting for people to represent their interests. And in the Confederacy, if they won the war and they preserved slavery for how many generations, civil rights would have been held back. And I would argue, even today in the 21st century, we would still not have it in the American South.
So you think, Tim, it's feasible slavery goes on into the 20th century in the Confederacy?
In my opinion, yes, because of the connection between white supremacy and slavery.
I think, Tim, the issue here is, I think it splits, doesn't it? Whether it's slavery. I think the issue is the supremacy argument. I think my contention is I think slavery would have had to disappear for the Confederacy to survive as a social economic entity. It's got lots of resources, but it has to trade. But you're right. I think the issue is about supremacy. If slavery had disappeared within a generation, as I believe, the supremacist arguments would have persisted. And again, as you said, James, it would have been very much like white South Africa and black South Africa, the way it went.
You'd have an even more aggressive form of segregation.
Segregation rather than anything else, both horizontally and within society. So Gettysburg, for me, results, I think, either way, in slavery being abolished, I think, within a generation, but this supremacist argument persisting. Let's face it, I mean, that did persist into the almost to the 21st century, and I think that's the more natural progression. I mean, I think Tim explained that very, very articulately in some ways,
Tim, final thought from you on slavery, and then we'll come on to some of the geopolitics.
I mean, I've said what I said. The Civil War is the war that ends the largest slave society in the New World. And, it's important to kind of comprehend that slavery did not die any sort of natural death here in North America. It had to be ended through violence. And that is the long-term legacy of the Civil War, is that it was the moment that Americans finally lived up to the promise they had made in 1776. This was a nation where all men would be created equal.
And as expressed in the Gettysburg...
For 80 years, they hadn't lived up to that. And that's why the Gettysburg Address is, in my opinion, one of the most important speeches, right? Because that's where Lincoln articulates this.
Absolutely.
And if the people of the free states did not know it already, the Gettysburg Address made it clear that this was not just a war to reunite the nation; it was also a war to end slavery.
Let's come on to the geopolitics, because there are so many what-ifs here. Dr. Chris Parry, you've got the Confederacy as an independent nation, you've got the North, the Union, as an independent nation. The United States of America, as we know it now as a project, never happened. Presumably that means that the North, or the US of what remains of it, is not top country in the 20th century.
Well, I don't know. I think sandwiched between Canada and the Confederate States, you've got quite a mighty nation here. There's no question. You've got a continent-sized country that's expanding to the west. It's got two major oceans either side of it, I think it still could have actually made it, to tell you the truth. And here's another thing. Don't count against basically the southern states and the northern states coming together again.
And okay.
So they might have actually had joint interests here. At one stage, there was a suggestion that when you've got 1 million in your army in the Union, we might go and take Canada as well. And one of the big fears of the British Empire was that that would happen. But let's not obviously upset the Union, because they might turn their army on completion of this war to the north and take over Canada as well.
So you think the North think, hang on, we've lost the South, we need to expand, we'll go north, we'll go into Canada?
Possibly, yeah. So there's a real issue here. I think this is a huge entity in the middle here. And essentially, I mean, as you say, if the Confederacy had gone into Mexico, for example, you're looking at a very large state to the south, but there's enough here to sustain a world power. There's no question about that. Let's face it, look at the size of Britain. I mean,
yeah.
You've got enough resources here in terms of manpower, land, natural resources.
Most of the wealth is concentrated in the north.
And the industry is here. And as long as, of course, you kept friendly relations with the Confederacy, yeah, you can survive. You can become a superpower if you want to. Yeah, anything could have happened there. You could have had 2 superpowers here.
Tim, fascinated to get your thoughts on this. Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. I think Chris has a really strong point that there could have been a reunion later on based on international politics, because as we know, in the 1890s, the United States decides to embark upon kind of its own imperialist ventures. And I think they would be stronger as a reunited nation. The only kind of hitch to this is the actual history of the memory of the war is very sectional. You know, even with a reunited nation, former Union and Confederate soldiers really despise each other's interpretations of the war. So there's a lot of kind of sectional division well into the 20th century, even until the last Civil War veteran leaves the stage in the 1950s. So we cannot discount the fact that sectional animosity coming from the war persists for a very long time, and that could actually prevent a possible reunification. And how that changes 20th century history, we don't know. It's entirely possible that America might not play as prominent a role in the 20th century, even in the world wars, if it is divided. You know, there's a very strong neutrality movement in the 1930s, and who knows if you have a divided nation, whether it is strong enough to actually keep the U.S. out of World War II. No, big questions that we can't answer, but again, it just makes me shudder to think of what the world would be like if it was 2 different countries.
Chris, I mean, we're getting into the realm of wild speculation, but heck, this is what we love on History Undone. I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, do either of the American nations, as it were, take a side in the wars?
Well, it depends on their geopolitical complexion at the time. I mean, as Tim points out, there's a strong isolationist element. It may well be that they take different sides. If you've still got a very strong white supremacist element in the Southern Confederacy, some of the fascist views are actually very attractive. Some of the eugenics that are portrayed by the totalitarian regimes in Europe align with that. I mean, that's a really nightmare situation. Just think about a Southern Confederate state that is actually aligned with some of the totalitarian states, while the conventional United States is actually aligned with the democracies.
But you see, you could almost make the argument both ways, because you could say the Confederacy might have been on the side of the Allies, because it may have had a very long-standing relationship with Britain, dating back to its inception in the 1860s. And I mean, on that, Tim, to bring you in, do you think in the latter part of the 19th century the Confederacy would have had quite a close alliance with Britain?
Potentially. Britons were very divided about the Civil War, right? Generally, the working class British subjects were aligned with the North. They kind of saw a lot of themselves in Northern factory workers, but then the British aristocracy was more supporting the Confederacy. They were the ones that were helping to raise money to build raiding ships and blockade runners for the Confederacy. So potentially, if the Confederacy became independent, they would have a strong ally in some of the wealthiest people in Great Britain that could have easily been nurtured deep into the 19th century. So one of the reasons we might say the Confederacy might avoid the possibility of a reunification with the North is simply because it has much stronger allies over in Europe. It's difficult to speculate, but there are some historical precedents that kind of suggest that the Confederacy does not turn its attention to its own continent, but looks elsewhere for allies.